Welcome everybody. This is Nadine Zacharias representing the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education. This webinar on the really exciting topic of Equity 2030, a long-term strategic vision for student equity in higher education. I'm your host for today's webinar, and I would like to introduce my co-presenters for today, who are Matt Brett at La Trobe University, who was a 2017 Equity Fellow with the National Centre and a co-facilitator for the workshop that we held in Melbourne. Dan Edwards, who is Research Director Tertiary Education at ASA and was a participant on the day, and Sally Kift, who is, among many other things, a 2018 NESHE Visiting Fellow, and who provided a context-setting session on the day that many said should be mandatory viewing for everyone working in this space. So Sally is going to present an abbreviated version of that session to you today. First of all, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country, which is an interesting concept in a webinar situation, because we're meeting all over the country. There are more than 40 of you in the session and counting. But I'm acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation because Matt, Dan and I are in Melbourne, and so this is the country from which we're being broadcast to you today. This is the fourth and final webinar of the Building Legacy and Capacity series, which is a strategic initiative that the National Centre has implemented over the past 12 months. I'm going to introduce it quite briefly at the start of the session before handing over to our presenters to talk to you about the discussion and the insights from the final workshop that was held in Melbourne just on 2 weeks ago. What you'll see is that we had some reasonably complex discussions on the day that we condensed into a 30-minute presentation for you to really serve as a discussion starter. We very much want to continue the conversation that started during that workshop because we can't exactly say that all the questions got resolved on the day, and we shall show you what further opportunities there are to contribute to this conversation beyond the webinar. A little bit of housekeeping. You'll see that we have a captioner who is live captioning for us, which is coming up on your screens. You can resize this, just have a bit of a play with that. There's also a question pod at the bottom of your control panel, and I encourage you to learn to love that control panel. It's either on the right-hand side or left-hand side of your screen. There's various ways of resizing the screens and making some things bigger than others. There's also an opportunity for you to ask questions of us during the session and at the end. There's a drop-down menu towards the bottom of the control panel where you can leave your questions and they will come through to us, and then we can pick them up. We'll have a little conversation between presentation and then a longer session for discussion at the end. There's also the opportunity, if the technology doesn't work for you at all, which I hope is not the case, to get in touch with Jane, who is supporting us technically during the webinar. So the email address there is admin@adcet, that's adcet.edu.au, in case you have any technical glitches or questions. We are planning to present for about 20 minutes and then open up for a brief discussion in the middle of the session. Continue to talk a bit about the outcomes from the workshop and then open it up for a more comprehensive Q&A in the second half of the session. I'm going to launch into it now and start with a bit of an introduction of the Building Legacy and Capacity Building series, and hope that my presentation works. Here you are. Okay, so the logic behind the concept really came from the National Centre Board, which was looking for an avenue to leverage NESHE-funded research and develop a format that enabled really productive conversations about complex issues, because we felt there was good material that was held in lots of reports that sat on a website, and we were looking for ways to extract this good information and the people who had conducted the research to really advance a national conversation. The topics that we have looked at during the workshop series were quite diverse, as you can see. So the first workshop looked at career education in low SES regional remote schools. We then looked at current students from regional and remote backgrounds. Last workshop was on evaluating Indigenous higher education, and now this current one, which was really forward-looking and very much in the spirit of legacy building from the current work that many of us have been engaged in. The objectives of the workshop are to define a collective knowledge base that can inform future research and practice, to collectively engage in strategic and action planning to inform institutional practice and future research, and to develop evidence-informed policy advice. The structure of the workshop is very consistent. So there are 6 high-level questions which frame group discussions, and they are there on the screen. So we very much look at the nature of the problem. We are quite keen about success. You know, what does success look like? What do we already know? What sort of principles can we articulate for good practice? How does government relate to the issue? And are there any gaps in knowledge that would promote more positive changes if we had the answers to some questions? Each of the conversations was informed by a set of pre-reading materials, and you have been provided with those as part of your registration email. There will be a follow-up publication from the workshop. In this case, we are developing a discussion paper. These were the experts on the day. And we were ably supported by the research team from the NESHE. So you can see it was a really illustrious group of participants, and I am handing over to Sally now to take you through her context setting piece that she provided on the day with a bit more detail, but I guess we had to fit it all in to this webinar format, and Sally talks very fast. So Sally, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nadine, and welcome to everybody, and I'm delighted to be able to take part in this. So if you'll forgive the speed of this, but it was just to try and suggest to you that there's a lot going on at the moment, and probably the takeaway is that equity is quite vulnerable in this space, and it's probably the Ernst & Young report, which is at the bottom of that screen. April was a big month. There are a whole pile of reports came out, and you've got them captured there. The Ernst & Young one I'm just going to focus on for a minute, because that's the one that I think you'll find your institutional leadership are probably reading. There's only one mention of equity in that report, and that was in the context of the policies that created equity and diversity are now, and the quote is, constraining evolution in the context of the need to assure a competitive workforce. So we all need to be always vigilant. Thanks, Nadine. We're extremely fortunate in the sector to have the Mitchell Institute. If I could have the next slide, please, Nadine. The Mitchell Institute has done some fantastic work, and you've got 2 of the reports there. I'm not seeing the slide change over. I'm not sure if that's working. I'll keep going. Thanks, Nadine. So this is the Mitchell Institute report looking at participation in higher education, and again, it's so disappointing that in 2018, when we should really have been reaching peak equity and peak participation because of our years of patient outreach work, the cap's gone back on. As the Mitchell Institute has said, even if the trends of the last 2 years were continuing in both higher education and vocational education, there still wouldn't be enough growth in higher education to offset a steep fall in equity, and we'd be going backwards. I've just given you there the higher education participation possibilities. The upward trajectory would have been if we had kept going for 2018. The flat line is after the 2 years of cap if we just do it on the basis of population growth, and the decreasing line is in higher education. So again, it would be worse if VET was also included, but a decreasing line if they don't relieve the caps in any way. If I could have the next slide, please. We're also been fortunate and have been long served by the Grattan Institute, which produced its usual rigorous analysis in the Dropping Out report that was released in April. Useful breakdown of the points of vulnerability, as you can see there on the screen, and I think we've all known this, but good to have it set out. Very usefully also, the Grattan Institute did identify the strong benefit of being at uni and doing some study even if you don't complete. But the next slide please, Nadine. But the real problem potentially with what Grattan has suggested, and they recommended that QUILT should include, the Quality Indicators of Learning and Teaching site should include personalised information on risk of non-completion. So students could go in and put in their variables and find out how likely it was they would not complete, and here's a picture of what that looked like. If you were a student that was studying in a remote area, so you're not Indigenous, you're a male, you're speaking English at home and you have no disability. If you're studying remotely, from a remote area, you've already got a 36% chance of not completing. If you move to a metropolitan campus, that decreases by 7%, but then if you make the bad decision to drop 4 subjects and go part-time, your chances of not completing have been increased by 35%, and if you go to study off campus then it's another 2%. So you end up with a grand total of a 66% total risk of non-completion. The report generated headlines that many of you probably would have seen, that dropout's pretty easy to predict, you just have to be part-time and online. Don't know that that's necessarily the message we want to be sending our cohorts. Next slide please, Nadine. You will have seen continually this focus on fixation and moral panic around ATAR, and ATAR is a pretty blunt and inaccurate instrument. I think we would all agree. Again, the Mitchell Institute's come to our salvation by some rigorous work saying that only about 26% of students are now being admitted on the basis of ATAR. You'll see that's decreased from when TEQSA and the Higher Education Standards Panel did its work in 2014, when there were 31% of students getting admitted on the basis of ATAR. So the point is, we have many other bases for admission, and many of the vulnerable equity cohorts are coming in via very diverse pathways. It would be my suggestion that as part of the equity visioning for 2030, I think we really need to take a position on ATAR and say what our preferred position around tertiary entrance might look like. The next slide please, Nadine. And then we come to a particularly happy place. For those of you who are not familiar, on the 8th of June, the Higher Education Standards Panel produced its final report on improving retention, completion and success in higher education. There's a lot to like in this report. It's a lot of what we want. Just to deal with Grattan at the first instance, they made no recommendation as regards Grattan's recommendation that quite rude measure of potential for non-completion should go up on the QUILT website. They dealt with it far more sympathetically and suggested that as part of a required mandated retention strategy that every institution should have, there should be an entry interview with every student, and the students should be encouraged to think about what their completion prospects might be at that point, and then that enrolment be reviewed for those who have not engaged with their studies to the level that they might have been discussing by census date. But apart from the requirement for a retention strategy, there's also a recommendation, and the government has accepted all 18 recommendations in this regard, so again a lot to celebrate. There's a recommendation that every institution have a mental health strategy and an implementation plan. The work done at La Trobe in particular around suggesting that we have nested courses with appropriate exit points to demonstrate to students that they've achieved and been successful, that's been recommended. That there be better careers advising for both school leavers and mature age, and that there be a careers interview on entry, so that's pretty exciting. The panel identified and dealt sympathetically with the fact that external students are probably 2.5 times more likely to withdraw, and said that institutions should pay particular attention to that. Anyway, I'd recommend that report to you. And my final slide, Nadine, is just to remind us and everyone that there's been a lot of work in this place. The NESHE Fellows have done fantastic work, and a lot of that work you'll see picked up in the Higher Education Standards Panel report. When I spoke at the opening of the National Centre when it was at the University of South Australia in 2008, I talked about transition pedagogy. So we know that we've got a lot to do to get students to come in, but once they're in our institutions we need to work hard to support them and to rise to the challenge of the great trust that they place in us. We need joined up institutional approaches, academic and professional staff working together in a partnership that takes student success seriously. As Vincent Tinto says, students won't rise to low expectations, and equity practitioners need to have a place at the curriculum design, redesign table to make sure that we're holding everyone accountable to an inclusive education. I'll hand over now to Dan Edwards.
Thanks, Ali, and thank you for having me, and hello to everybody out there in webinar land. My role, as Nadine said, was as a workshop participant in the workshop a couple of weeks ago, and I have been tasked with talking a bit about the threshold issues that that were thrashed around early on in the workshop, and really the focus of talking about the threshold issues were to begin to identify or talk about some of the key things that were impeding progress in the area or that we need to address in order to move forward. So thinking of it as a threshold, we need to get over this to move forward. It was a very complex discussion, and there was a range of issues and a lot of whiteboard use space being used by Nadine in particular in that workshop. So what I have to say here is really not doing it justice, but it's something that we've tried to work together to find some of the key themes that came out of the day and out of that discussion, and hopefully seeing how that leads into what the rest of the discussion is going to be about that follows me. So the main points that we have up on the screen there cover some of those issues. So one of them is the prominence of equity fading in mainstream policy debates. There was a lot of talk about a shift in focus over recent years, and we can track that over many decades, but even in recent years a shift from participation and access being very monitored and key areas that have been talked about to more about value for money and certainly performance, which is coming in as a big dialogue in the sector at the moment. There was discussion about the discourse regarding access still being dominated by a focus on merit-based access for school leavers, and that's at the detriment of talking about the other sort of 50% of people who get into university, who commence university each year, which is mature age people, students and people who are coming via pathways that are not ATAR-based pathways. Now, Sally's already spoken about the ATAR issues already, so I won't go on that, but I think it's important to note that there was discussion and recognition that the non-ATAR pathways groups are much more likely to be equity students than the high-performing school leavers with a high ATAR. So that's why it's important to change the discourse around that group. There was also a lot of discussion about context and making sure that we again recognise that higher education doesn't operate inside a bubble. The system that spans, our system spans schools, vet and industry. All the pathways that we have into and out of the higher education sector rely on the workforce, rely on schools, rely on vet, rely on a whole lot of other aspects. Those aspects impact on who gets in, who gets out, what the outcomes are for people who are leaving the tertiary sector, etc. So it's just important. We often do think about context, but it's just an important thing to re-emphasise that there is context to the higher ed system. Also, in terms of this, we were talking about it being global, and so there's a broad global perspective. In an equity-based context, there was also some discussion about international students, the fact that they make up 25% of our student population, but when it comes to equity discussions, they're not discussed all that much, and that there are potentially equity dimensions relating to this group. I think there's been some research around first in family, for example. We also know that there are different metrics which might track these students going not as well as some others. So just the global perspective is not just about the world as an industry, but also the way that Australian higher education is attracting students in. The building of an innovation economy is not possible without strong, accessible higher education. Higher education sector is another issue that was discussed. The accessible word in there is important in the context that we were discussing this. And again, this is context, recognising that there's a balance and there's a key role for higher education that higher education plays in Australia, in the Australian economy. But that I think also it's important to know that there's a balance there between what higher education can do and what other parts of our economy can do, for example, migration. The second last dot point there is sort of self-explanatory, that institutions are responsible for supporting the students that they enrol. This is coming through in terms of some of the performance-based and standards panel discussions of late. Sorry about that. But in more detail, simplistically, it's about knowing who the students are and what their needs are, and for institutions to be able to support. The last one there was about principles of equitable access to higher education, and that we need to flow through from equity groups into individuals who experience other kinds of disadvantage. We know there's some work going on in this space at the moment, but outside of the groups that we tend to focus on, there's often a lack of recognition of other areas of disadvantage and groups or people who might have disadvantages, refugees, care leavers, first in families, even international students in some respects need to be thought about too, and perhaps there's need to think about the way that these issues are captured in the future. So in the next slide, we also talked about progressing beyond the threshold, and really where Matt's going to take us in his presentation really pushes down this way, but I thought this was useful just to show where the discussion around threshold issues sort of came to a head or had these thoughts about where are we going to go. And I'm not going to go into detail on these ones except just to broadly say that there was a very strong discussion about focusing on positive rather than deficit when it comes to talking about equity. There was a discussion about broadening our understanding of the student population and its diversity within higher education, and recognition this is happening. Half of Sally's presentation before was about some great stuff that is happening in this area, and talking about how communicating communicating this diversity can have an impact if it's done in the right way. And the last point was better articulating the context of higher education sector in Australia and in the globe. Matt will talk in much more detail about this, but there was a sense early on in the discussions about clarifying the role of higher education in skills development, in social wellbeing, in a whole range of other areas that fit within what is it that higher education is setting out to achieve. And there was a caveat in terms of that kind of discussion about recognising that higher education shouldn't be tasked with solving all the world's problems, or just because there are these dimensions to it, it fits within a wider context and it can't solve everything all the way through. So that's a quick spin-off, and I apologise for the phone calls in between. I'll pass it on to Nadine now, who will talk a bit more about the Fair Chance for All aspect of this.
Thank you, Dan. And I'll just get my audio and video back. And while I do, I've put up for discussion the objective of a fair chance for all, which we had a good look at on the day. and basically ask the question, is the objective of a fair chance for all still valid? And this is the question I'd like to throw to you. So while you have a think about it, I'll read it to you. The overall objective for equity in higher education is to ensure that Australians from all groups in society have the opportunity to participate successfully in higher education. This will be achieved by changing the balance of the population to reflect more closely the composition of society as a whole. And I mean, all of us in this space know that Australia is aiming for proportionate representation. So equity students as a share of the student population in order to achieve equity, but also know that that is not universally the case, so that other jurisdictions use quite different ways at coming at the issue. What I'd like to encourage you to do is you can ask questions or raise your hand on your panel, and if you do that and want to say something in response to this question of is the objective of a fair chance for all still valid, I can unmute your microphone and you can make a comment to the total group. So if we have any brave participants who want to say something in response to this question or in response to Dan's and Sally's presentations about context, I'm happy to throw it to you. No? We have a few people who were there on the day, people who, you know, were participants in the workshop. Does anyone want to make a comment? No? I'm happy to hold this. I'm happy to hold this over to the next session. We'll have a bit more time for Q&A at the very end. I might just throw it over to Matt and talk to us about the outcomes from the session and some of the strategic objectives that we identified on the day. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Nadine, and thanks also to Sally and Dan. Before sort of getting into too much detail around the way forward that was discussed at the workshop, I think it's worthwhile just to kind of pause just a little bit on that last slide to say, recognise that it is actually quite a very big question. So we've put you on the spot there, you know, sort of asking, is this legacy framework, is it still valid in a context where we've just thrown a whole lot of challenges at you in terms of what's going on in the sector and what some of the threshold issues are, etc. So hopefully, as we work through the kind of strategic priorities moving forward, you can reflect a little bit more on the legacy and impact of a fair chance for all, and the, you know, your response to that, you know, question: is it still valid? And on that point, I think it's worthwhile, even if we think about what we're doing here today, we're all dialing in and video conferencing in from all parts of the country with a live steno captioner giving us live accessible content. In some ways, we've got to this point of having this accessible platform because the sector has changed, but also because we've had a long-term focus on accessibility and access for various equity groups. So a very presence here today is a legacy of that framework in some ways. And along those lines, a key outcome of the workshop was a recognition that the frameworks that we have are actually pretty good. Australia's got a very good higher education sector. It's got good equity practices in lots of ways. We've got a higher education loan program, for example, that is the envy of the world in many respects. And that was very much a feature of the product at the time and the focus of equity around the Dawkins reforms of higher education. And a fair chance for all is really part of that. So what was a kind of message that came through loud and clear through the workshop was not that we need to throw out a fair chance for all, or throw out some of those other frameworks, but just to recognise that they have been really important. They continue to be important, but we perhaps need to refine and tweak them to respond to some of the current challenges, to be able to address some of those threshold issues and to prepare the sector for a future that's still a little bit uncertain, where the role of technology, the role of globalisation, etc., is in some ways potentially really challenging the foundations of the sector and our assumptions about it. So it's about sort of building and extending a fair chance for all, rather than saying it doesn't matter anymore, or that it was a bad framework that no longer serves its purpose. So really kind of recognising and celebrating a fair chance for all, but tweaking it and refining it a little bit is the sort of key message from there. Might come to the next slide, please, Nadine. So the next priority from that, and it sort of came up through the early discussion from Sally and Dan, is that we need to hook into the broader sort of context, any tweaks to the equity frameworks that we might have that connect to the overarching objectives for higher education and increasingly tertiary education. And with that, most people would have had access to some pre-reading. Not everyone may have had time to go through all those details, but a key element of that reading was just reminding people of the work of Martin Troe and the whole concept of mass and universal tertiary higher education. We're pretty much there in Australia right now. Around 50% of school leaders now move into tertiary education in some form. That's about 40% for higher education, and that is likely to grow, notwithstanding any challenges or issues that we have that we face right now. So we need to sort of think about what this long-term overarching objective is for higher education, recognising that it's likely to have a universal participation dimension to it, and really making clearer the connection between equity and that broader sort of function of higher education. In some ways, the cues for that are already there in existing policy and legislation, which talks about the knowledge functions of higher education, the role it plays in social wellbeing and economic productivity and development. So it's kind of reconnecting our equity frameworks to remind people that equity is a really core part of these fundamental objectives of higher education. But doing it in a way that really addresses the needs of policymakers and decision makers. So it kind of speaks their language, and that it picks up on some of the issues that, again, were sort of called out by Sally and Dan, but might include greater recognition of things like lifelong learning, health and wellbeing, employment outcomes, diversity in Australian society, and accountability issues, and getting a return on public investment and private investment in higher education. We also need to do that in a way that really moves away from the deficit approach of thinking about equity, and trying to elevate and promote the status of equity as a key and important component of what we do, rather than some marginalised or kind of side issue that's only the preserve of some members of the higher education sector. That is particularly the case when it comes to inappropriate benchmarking, where in some cases the history and the disband that is associated with some groups can see benchmarks placed on their performance which could serve to exclude them, rather than finding ways of really challenging the structures in the system that could support their inclusion over the longer term. That gets us to the next strategic priority, which is thinking about a multi-dimensional concept of success. And on the day, I would say that most of the discourse and conversation was really focused. We certainly engaged some sector thought leaders on some of these really vexing questions. But it wasn't until we got to this kind of concept of success that we moved away from I suppose, a consensus view of what the challenges and issues were and what some of the responses might be, to recognising that kind of success for many is a problematic term that can be misused in some way. So we need to approach this kind of notion of success in a way that's multidimensional, that can accommodate some of the perspectives that many people have around success in ways that are really connected to the overarching objectives of higher education. We see in other systems, like the school education system, we've got nuanced measures of success and equity, particularly with the EXIA framework that's in use with the MySchool and NAPLAN. And I think another thing that sort of came out from the workshop discussions and some of the work that myself, Nadine, Dan and Sally have done post-workshop in trying to extract meaning from this is to really kind of place the interest of students at the forefront of what we're trying to do here. And whatever we do needs to be in the best interest of students, not necessarily can respond to some kind of policy compromise that might be struck at any point in time. We also need to do this in a way that it really doesn't privilege the quantitative over the qualitative and recognises the strength and importance of both. So it's as much about the stories as the stats and the numbers, and we need to put that in context so that we understand the whole picture of what works for whom, in what context and why. And I think it's probably fair to say that, notwithstanding the strength of the Australian higher education system, we've got a long way to go in terms of really having a nuanced appreciation of that very question. What interventions work, for whom, why, etc. And that's partly why there's been so much emphasis on evaluation of equity policy in recent times. That gets us on to the last strategic priority, which is about equity evaluation. So having been clear about what our objective might be and how that hooks into the broader social and economic narrative that's driving Australian policy making over the long term, and having a clear sense of what success might mean, it's just making sure that we've got both the capability and the infrastructure in the system to be able to move forward with assessing the success of equity policy over the longer term. And in some ways, an important kind of recognition for this is that the critical mass of equity researchers we could have more. We could have a little bit more research, a little bit more research funding, a stronger pipeline of equity researchers that help the system to be able to best fulfil the equity objectives that it's setting, with a culture that sees equity evaluation as just part of what various institutions might be doing, rather than something that only a small subset of practitioners might be actively concerned with. And making sure that we've got the best methodologies, the best data, the best research infrastructure to make that happen. In terms of next steps for how we might progress with that, it's worthwhile kind of recognising that there is quite a lot of information and research that's been done about equity, but we haven't necessarily pulled it all together into a coherent form with a kind of meta-analysis and synthesis that would help us best understand what we could do better as a system. There's also a lot of data in the system that's not been as well utilised as it could be. So part of this infrastructure piece is to make sure that we have access to and can best make use of the data we already collect, rather than making it a kind of issue of having to collect orders of magnitude more data to support our evaluation processes. Some of this has been picked up by the Research and Innovation Panel, and the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education has just loaded up all the reports that have come from national priority projects over the last few years into a single repository, which is a fantastic achievement in its own right. The task now in some ways is to start to pull those threads and the other research literature together to really help us inform what we're doing over the long term. So moving on to the last slide, which is a first attempt or a first draft of being able to pull these things together. The context, the broader direction of higher education, the contemporary challenges and the strategic priorities. What Nadine, myself, Sally and Dan have done is to pull together a vision statement, which in some ways has a kind of resonance and connection to a fair chance for all and the objectives that were stated earlier, but it tries to start to funnel all these things down into a single slide that kind of names all the elements that we're trying to grapple with, which would then allow us over the longer term to start to unpack those into more detailed policies and practices. And on the top of the list is a kind of statement of Australian tertiary education system objectives, which pull together the relevance of tertiary education for social wellbeing and cultural, intellectual life, as well as the sort of economic productivity angle as well. That becomes the overarching kind of context in which we need to look into. And is a kind of restated equity dimension of that, which is to say that all members and groups in society have access to high quality learning experience opportunities aligned with their aspirations and which fulfil their learning potential. So it's a kind of slight tweak to the way in which the Chancellor Hall sort of framed these things, and puts emphasis on all people, recognising that different people will have different aspirations and start from different places, but as part of a lifelong learning journey, that there's a consistent opportunity to access high quality education at every step of the life course. And we're hoping to get feedback on this kind of statement from everyone that's participating in this webinar today. But if those aspects of the vision are valid, we then need to sort of integrate that vision within the system, and that opens up a number of system level considerations, particularly that the system is by design able to accommodate the diversity that's present in Australian society for all groups, all communities, all individuals in some ways, and that despite our best efforts at designing a system that's accessible to all, can recognise that we might need some additional interventions to help some people for whom we cannot accommodate through those broad system design features. Lastly, there's a commitment to evaluation and making sure that we just embed within our system a capacity of constantly assessing and evaluating, number one, both the objective, how we're tracking against it, and whether or not we need to change anything as a sort of cyclical dynamic process rather than a kind of fixed point in time. It becomes more of a process solution than a specific policy intervention in its own right. So having gone through the Equity 2030 vision statement as a discussion draft, what we're going to do is just kind of communicate what some of the next steps might be and then throw it open to sort of Q&A. And the next steps, bigger picture considerations, are really kind of responding to that universal participation dimension, where there's in some ways a greater focus on personalised learning and individual needs being met, and how do we kind of do that in an efficient way and in a way that recognises that we don't have a magic pudding that can throw infinite resources at this particular issue, and also doing that without making too many assumptions about where students are coming from. Part of that will be how we utilise online and flexible learning technologies, and again today is a great example of what technology can do. But this is just the starting point of what might happen over the longer term. We also need to sort of think about the level of differentiation in the system. Right now Australia's got a small number of very large institutions, and one can ask whether or not these institutions can meet the needs of a very diverse kind of student population. And lastly, kind of thinking about this kind of question that Dan raised before around whether or not this is equity for society or is it equity in higher education, how do they fit together, which is in itself a very, very big question and sort of proposition. Nadine and I and other members of our National Centre will be preparing a discussion paper that takes this information and discusses it in much more detail than we've been able to do in today's webinar. But right now it's over to you guys to give us a sense as to what you've made of the content that we've provided to you today, and that discussion is going to be led by Nadine. So over to you, Nadine.
Okay, thanks a lot to Matt and to all of the presenters, and yes, it's over to you. And I think to ease us into it, I have 3 questions already, so I'll start us off with those, and while we are discussing those questions, others can think of their own and send them through to generate just a bit more conversation. We have 15 minutes, so keep those questions coming. The first one was by Ian Cunningham, and Sally, it's a question for you. And it goes very much towards, whose responsibility is it? So is there a responsibility by the students? What is the responsibility of the institution? So Ian asks, would a better use of the Grattan's risk factor presentation be to show institutions where they need to focus support resource development? Analysis, so this is an example, analysis consistently shows part-time study is a significant risk factor for disengagement, but are universities taking this feedback on board and taking steps to engage part-time students? Sally, do you want to take that in the first instance?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the question. Yes, I don't think the suggestion is that we're going to argue with the facts. It's the question about how we mediate that information to our equity cohorts. And so I'm much more taken, so thank you to the Grattan Institute for pointing that out. It's not something that we're unaware of. You only need to look at Louise Pollard's NESHE Fellowship, for example, on regional and remote students, who are all of those things and more. I'm worried about the vulnerability of students being presented with such a rude outcome by feeding their data into a national website. As I was about to say, I'm much more taken with the Higher Education Standards Panel idea that we would have these conversations with our students on entry into higher education. It's already been put to me, how do we do that with 11,000 students if that's the first year cohort of some of the bigger institutions? Well, that's a problem, isn't it? So we'll need to think about how we scale it up, but I think the fact that it's somewhat difficult and inconvenient for institutions doesn't abrogate the responsibility. So let's have those discussions, and they can be over a period of time to make sure that our students understand that there are, and I'm not quite sure what the language might be, risk factors potentially, but this is how we can plan and this is how we would make them successful. So I commend the Higher Education Standards Panel discussion around this to you.
Thank you, Sally. We have another question by Anne Bowden, who asks, would any presenters like to comment on their knowledge of current academic staff backgrounds regarding their entry? That is, did they come via ATAR or another pathway? I'm not sure that we have this kind of information, but others might jump in. But what I would say in response to your question, Anne, we had a really interesting experience at Deakin where we had a project on first and family students as an attempt to change the narrative and find alternative ways to talk about the experiences of students coming in, without the cultural capital that is often assumed in participating in higher education. And we had any number of academics putting their hand up to say, I am a first and family student, I am a first and family academic, and they wore it as a badge of honor over time. So we had this little email signature that identified people as a first and family student, and it went all the way up to the Vice Chancellor, who's quite proud to say she's a first and family student, and very much takes that perspective into her job. So I guess from that perspective, we have some knowledge and understanding that there's quite a large cohort among staff from a first and family background, but I'm not aware of that we have any information about their entry pathways. Anyone else in the presenter group? I take silence as no. No, Matt, you have a go.
I might jump in there and say that our staff collection around higher education is compared to the student collection quite inadequate. We don't really capture much information systematically around the diversity of staff coming into higher education, nor their specific sort of backgrounds or entry to higher education, etc. There's in some states, New South Wales, for example, has for a long period of time reported on the number of staff in receipt of a disability-related adjustment. It's the only state that's done that systematically, but just kind of underscores that we can collect more information, we can report on more information, but we choose not to as a sector for various reasons. And I think having a clearer view about equity in the system will help drive the kinds of things that we might report on and the kind of data we might collect.
Thanks, Matt.
And just a quick comment from me. I mean, we know how agentic it is for students to see other students just like themselves who have been successful. I mean, wouldn't it be powerful if that was the conversation that academics had with their students on entry to institutions? So it's a fabulous idea. Let's do that.
Wonderful, thanks. More questions coming in now. Thank you for that. There's one from Ryan Cornwall from Monash Uni. And it goes to accountability. So Matt, you can get your camera and microphone ready, I guess. Should each university be individually accountable for equity representation as well as the whole sector? He says, as in proportional student populations, for example, from Monash.
So my fellowship last year was entitled Equity, Performance and Accountability, and that report will be coming out soon. So I've grappled with these kind of issues at length. I think what we should not be aiming for, in my view, is that every university be exactly the same. We should not be looking to have every university have exactly the same level of representation, and part of the reason for that is because different universities serve different purposes, different communities, and different communities have different characteristics. So, but what I think we should not be aiming for is letting any institution off the hook to say that they do not have a role to play in equity. And I think that's the conversation that Monash needs to have around what are its equity goals, how is it tracking against those, and how is it making itself accountable for progressing the goals that it does have.
Stay on the line, Matt. The next question is from Lolita McHenry, and she's asking, just wondering if the panel have reflected on the new Glyn Davis book and his predictions of what a future HE sector will look like, that is fewer institutions, micro-credentials and so on, and what this means for student equity.
I have read that book. It's on the bookshelf just behind me. It's probably very hard for you to see, but it's there behind me, and I have read it. I would disagree with some of Glyn's propositions around the institutional composition of Australian higher education, and I think the lessons for that are in part in the pre-reading that we sent through, particularly the Martin Troe article, which speaks to what's necessary in a universal higher education context to meet the needs of a diverse group of students. And I think it's very hard for a single institution or a small number of institutions to be all things to all people. That's my starting assumption, but Glyn's smarter than me and more knowledgeable than me, and maybe he's right, but I would maybe disagree with that. I think what we have in Australia is an institutional model that has concentrated institutional scale at university level and proliferated with very bad quality at a vet level. And I think one way or another we need to find a happy medium between the two so that our vet and our higher education system is much stronger with the right level of scale to maintain a viable level of quality without having one institution serving everyone's needs.
Thank you. Again, stay here. No, stay here. But before we go, maybe Dan and Sally, do you have any comments on Glyn's version of the future of higher education in Australia?
Not from me.
Sally,
Nor
from
me.
you? Okay, wonderful. Okay, we go to the next question, which is from Bronwyn Herbertson and goes to the draft equity vision. And Bronwyn asks, the new equity vision links higher education opportunities to groups and members' aspirations rather than to have participation reflecting numbers in society, so that, bedrock of proportional representation. Is it deliberate as a true societal reflection? As a true societal reflection is aspirational. For example, people with disabilities will not be reflected in higher education and participation numbers as they are in society. Matt, that is you times 2. You need to unmute, unmute your microphone. So.
Didn't click it as well as I would. I think one of the flaws with a Fair Chance for All as it currently stands is that it has pulled the focus of the system towards a couple of small groups and hasn't necessarily accommodated the diversity in Australian society. We don't, for example, in the same way that other countries or systems do, track issues of race. We don't track or consider issues of religion. We don't, for example, track issues of sexual preference, for example. So there's a few examples of things that we don't track. Disabilities, you know, is a very broad category that includes a whole range of body structures and functions. And yeah, my view is that what we need to do is find a framework that allows us to be able to pick up on all these diverse kind of threads in society without putting everyone into a low SES bucket or everyone into a regional bucket or everyone into a disability bucket that doesn't necessarily pick up the sophistication and nuance of those individual group issues. And in my report coming out soon, I'll provide a way of being able to maybe track and manage that across the system, across time, and hopefully that approach is something that has legitimacy and people pick up on. But my immediate response to your feedback is that this is by no means an attempt to marginalise disability or to not recognise its importance, but to find better ways of being able to integrate that within our equity vision.
Thank you. Time for one final question, and it is from Larissa again from Canberra University. Is the number of higher education institutions in Australia impinging upon our ability to achieve equity? And I'm not quite sure, Larissa, if you think we have too many or too few of them. Does somebody want to take that one? And maybe, extrapolate what would happen if we had a lot more or a lot less?
Sorry, I mean, I want to give Sally and maybe Sally go first and I might come in after Sally.
I don't know that I have anything particularly clever to say, other than that I think as we investigate a joined up tertiary education system, there will be more. So and put VET on an equal footing with higher education, particularly in the circumstances where we're looking at the potential for further inequity exacerbated by the technological revolution. I'm constantly worried about that. So there are those aspects. One of the things that I do also worry about, I'm just going to use this as an opportunity to put this in there, is the opportunity for equity groups to access postgraduate education as the new normal becomes an undergraduate degree. That'll be a new frontier for equity, I imagine. How we might enable clear pathways into that variety of systems is always a problem, and I think there was a clear admission that admissions transparency, while going some way towards that, still didn't mediate and to help students to navigate complex pathways into higher education, which is why the discussion about ATAR and those pathways is so important.
Thank you. And stay on the line, Sally, and you too, Dan. Larissa has just written in to clarify that she thinks there may be too many universities to achieve equity. Dan, do you want to have a go?
Oh, look, I was going to say something similar to what Sally was in terms of the changing possible linking up of systems and the broader context of higher education as being, what the groups that come into higher education are linked to what the school sectors what the school are able to produce, but also they're also linked to what's happening in the broader marketplace and what opportunities there are. So I think, I'm not sure about the overall numbers of institutions themselves, but in the last, since December with the changing and the uncapping of the system, the recapping of the system, some of those questions change. I think it changes quite a lot in terms of whether there is an opportunity for opening it up as widely as necessary or not. And I think that sort of frames a little bit of what I was going to say about that. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Matt, one final comment?
Two things I draw people's attention to in terms of the size and scale of universities in Australia. If you look at somewhere like the US, picking up on Sally's point around postgraduate, and so it's fantastic that we've got someone like Sally doing the review of the AQF. It means that we will have these kind of discussions right in the heart of the design of Australian higher education moving forward. Fantastic. But looking at something like Carnegie Rand Graduate School in the US, people may have heard of Rand Corporation as a consulting group. That runs PhD programs only in public policy, only PhDs in public policy. That's all they do. Whereas in Australia, we're all things to all people. At the other end of the kind of spectrum, somewhere like Gallaudet University only teaches in ASL, American Sign Language. There are ways of being able to deliver higher education that do not require massive scale of the size that we see currently in some Australian universities. I think there's a lot to be said for that kind of approach. Whether or not we would achieve something like that is another sort of question, but I would question whether or not the University of Melbourne, for example, can offer the same level of service to Mildura as Melbourne, as Malvern and Warrnambool and Gippsland. I'm sort of perhaps banging a kind of drum here, but I think there are real questions around how big institutions can be and still deliver quality and accessibility.
Thank you, and I'm very aware we have run out of time, but I do want to thank a number of people, and I want to thank the co-presenters. I want to thank the team at the National Centre, and we've just received a really lovely thank you from one of our participants here, acknowledging some of the good work that the colleagues are doing, often behind the scenes. So thank you to the visible ones, and thank you to the invisible ones. I'd also like to acknowledge that we had several participants from the workshop in the webinar today. So a shout out to Kate Flynn and Wojtek Tomaszewski in particular for tuning in again, and to all of you for joining the conversation. This is not the end of it, that's just the start of it, and watch out for more opportunities to contribute to a longer term vision for equity. Final shout out to World Access to Higher Education Day, which is an international event that NESHE is part of. So we will host the Australasian hub event for World Access Day, which will take place on the 28th of November. So look out for that, more information to come very soon. This is it for us. That was the Building Legacy and Capacity Workshop series. I've seriously enjoyed working with all of you, and I hope the same is true for you. I'm sure we'll see many of you maybe in Auckland at the STARS conference or around the traps. Thank you all for participating, and see you soon. Bye for now.